Chapter 5. The Confrontation and a Most Disquieting Revelation on the Part of Cameron. The next day began with a swift change of pace for Cameron. He awoke almost excessively early and, rather than the outfit he had chosen the day before, opted for the neutral color palette that he was more accustomed to wearing. "I'm not here to impress anyone. I'm only here to do my job without distraction," was a phrase he had often repeated to himself, despite only half believing it. He proceeded to the office over an hour early, busied himself by sorting out portfolios and letters. He even emptied the garbage cans, despite it being the janitor's duty. Next, he swept up every last remnant of dirt, grime, and dust in the office. Following this, he opened up all the windows, an act typically regarded as anathema to Mr. Singer and his compatriots, but which Cameron deemed necessary to air out the copier room due to the plethora of dust in there. Following this, Cameron had approximately 20 minutes to spare. He gave himself a little break, plopped himself down on one of the few chairs in the compact, stuffy room, and poured himself some coffee, which he tempered with a half and half to moderate the bitterness. As he reclined back on the rusty metallic chair, he noticed something off-putting as he stared up at the ceilings, something that had come to his attention at brief moments before, which he never had the time to deal with. Not one, not two, or three, but 4 lights were entirely burnt out, and the only 2 ones amongst them that actually provided light, even they were flickering spasmodically. He decided to remedy this issue right away. He got up from a seat, ventured over to the supplies room, and approached a large filing cabinet where he opened the bottom drawer, located several light bulbs. He identified the correct number of watts, selected the appropriate ones. Before 10 minutes had passed, he had changed all the old, broken lights, replaced them with crisp new ones, with a fresh luster on them that emitted a comfortable amount of light so that everyone would be able to see again. No longer would people have to struggle to see, relying on what little daylight there was to assist them. Then there was light, he said aloud in an ironic tone, then immediately regretting it, and checking to see if anyone had arrived yet. At last, one by one, his co-workers arrived. He spotted some familiar faces among them. Sandy, who was an older dignitary who traveled to and from various business partners to vouch for the company, walked through the door. She was nice, he supposed, but then again, he never really had sufficient time to get to know her. He was always almost occupied by himself, with a couple of intercessors providing him middle ground work on copying and such. But he rarely had time to adequately get to know someone. Despite being chronically busy, Cameron felt on one hand that he was completely replaceable, but on the other hand, if he were to neglect his work even for a few minutes, the entire flow and order of the office would be jeopardized. It all depended on who was requesting the papers as he copied or worked, which changed multiple times daily. If it was anyone within Mr. Singer's immediate circle, as the people he liked to refer to as Singer's puppets, they would see to it that they were done without any qualms or toleration for any mistakes. However, if it were a much more cordial person, such as Donald, he wouldn't have to worry about absolute perfection, though he still aimed for high standards. Though he transcribed court documents, mostly by shorthand, he never had the opportunity to see papers in their final form, as they were often snatched from his hands and sent off to the others. Philip and Edward walked in, 2 workers who were often seen as a pair, and about whom it was joked that they could die together. These were likely the 2 most alien colleagues to Cameron. He never exchanged more than small talk with them. Following them, he spotted Carl, a relatively new hire who he actually knew better than Philip and Edward combined. This may have been because he has not been in his job as long and had not let the routine and mundanity get to him. However, if he were to end up in a supervisor position, the prospect of power could alienate himself from so many. How content and eager is the man whose career and place in life is still novel, never failing to keep abreast of the tides of change. Mr. DeBeer's words echoed distantly in his ears, as if the strange creature were dwelling between them, latching onto and underscoring his every thought, though he was not entirely sure he was the one who had said it. Finally, he spotted Robin pushing through the door and making his way toward his desk. This was an unusual sight, as he was typically posted off-site for resources and promotion by travel and work cases on the road, which were usually brief, and when he returned, he spent most of the day away from his desk and close to Mr. Singer's office upstairs, where he was often kept increasingly busy. Yet, he reclaimed the erstwhile desk which he hadn't seen for the past 2 days and acted as if he had returned from a brief lunch, dusted it off and plopped down on it and began right away on a seemingly pressing task. Cameron thought about just approaching him and catching up, but given their previous conversation and how awkward things must have become with him lately, he decided against it. It was like dealing with a primal animal, other than the original Robin he had met several years earlier, who had performed a host of practical jokes in the office to the vexation of Mr. Singer. Now the only person he was kidding was himself. He was so completely mirthless, sober, boring, devoid of wit that it seemed almost as if a poltergeist had sucked the life out of him, that he was essentially at the beck and call of Mr. Singer. Cameron decided to get started on his sizable stack of papers, but before he could, the tug of a hand on his back deterred him from doing so. "What's the deal with the break room?" It was Robin. His voice was gravely cold, and his expression matched it perfectly. "You mean the lights?" Cameron didn't bother to turn around completely, but only shifted his head ever slightly, enough to see him in his peripheral vision. It was not out of rudeness that he did this, but a severe lack of interest. "Yes, that's exactly what I mean. Did you change them?" Robin inquired, with a hasty, anxious demeanor as if somebody set the office on fire. "Yeah, it was too dark to see, so I changed them. What's the big deal with that?" Robin rolled his eyes, fluttered his arms in a slight frenzy, and settled them on his hips. "What's wrong with that? You have no place changing them. Jobs of that nature are reserved for maintenance and janitorial work only. Mr. Singer's going to have your head on a plate and serve you for breakfast. You've already set him off once. Now he'll be looking for something to get upset about. You know he always does. I don't see what I did wrong here. I mean, the light bulbs were dead and they needed switching. In fact, they've needed that for a long time. 6 weeks to be precise. What am I supposed to do? Wait for something that will never come? I honestly don't see what's wrong with changing them by myself. I'm perfectly capable of it." Cameron spoke with much more ease than usual. "The issue isn't whether or not you can change them by yourself or not. That's not open to investigation. What matters are the rules and whether they've been broken or not. And you've obviously broken them. The fact is that any handling of business property such as equipment, furniture, utilities, and tools, that includes light bulbs, will be subject to penalty. You can't just run your own show here. So the company is really going to care that much about some silly light bulb? The way I see it, I'm doing them a favor. I did it off the clock, too. That's even worse. I'd be extra careful about how you present your case to Mr. Singer. In fact, I think I'll tell him myself," Robin opined. "I really don't care what he has to say," Cameron said, so glibly and subtly that it didn't feel as if he said it. It was as if someone else was speaking through him. "I'm not scared of him, no matter how much he inflates, gloats, and burps around. For a man who shouts so much, he sure is a bore to listen to. I would fall asleep right through his militaristic brainwashing session. Chance if he didn't spit in my face so often." Again, Cameron felt the words arriving out of nowhere and being projected through him. What should he do? He'd never spoken like this before, not even to an equal. He felt a flow of adrenaline shoot through his veins. His legs and hands tensed up. "Wow, you really don't care about keeping this job, do you? I figured with all your status and rank, doing something that could be replaced in a matter of minutes, you'd be more careful about what you say. But you have no fear or dignity, do you?" Robin spoke with taciturn calculation as he folded his arms. "I just want to be spoken to as an equal, not as a servant to an insensitive, vapid suit-and-tie lickspittles like yourself, who are suddenly trying to flatter your way into a management scheme by seducing them with flattery and proposals. You can talk their ears off all you want about how committed and dedicated you are to this company, yet you would leave this place in a heartbeat if you smelled something slightly better off from miles away." Cameron felt a sudden urge to copy Robin's movements and cross his arms dismissively too, but he felt that his words were adequate. Robin's expression morphed into utter incredulity. "I can't believe you right now. To think you used to have at least an inkling of self-respect and decency. I don't know what's become of it because it's obviously not there anymore. I know we got on fine until recently, but just because we had some interesting banter and jokes doesn't make what you're doing right now acceptable by any means. Unless this is some elaborate joke you're pulling off. Is it?" Robin looked askance at Cameron. "No." Cameron decided he would fold his arms at this point to seem like it would get the message across more effectively. "Well, tell it to Mr. Singer, because I'm through trying to help you. You're a lost cause, Cameron, and I'll be the first to tell you that if you want to make it in this business, you better start making some serious changes starting right now. For now, out of kindness, I'll keep our little talk confidential. Don't think I'm doing you any favors. The only one hurting you is yourself. I know we're friends, and that's fine. We can even still grab a drink outside of work, but I need to let some things go in my life, especially things that have gone out of control." Robin spoke these words as if they were a gloomy augury and spun around on his heels. Right then, the familiar sound of heavy footsteps pounded the hardwood floor, and the silhouette of Mr. Singer bled through the blinds of the window on the hallway. He pushed through the door with his usual powerful lunge without laying a hand on it. He wasted no time before approaching Cameron, shouting at full volume, a noise which echoed throughout the office. "Callum! Where's Callum? There he is! You! He protruded his stubby finger as if he were eliminating suspects by trial and error. As much as he endeavored to hide from the beast of a man, it was not possible, so fighting the temptation to sink execrably into his chair, he decided to remain steadfast and visible. It's Cameron, he corrected, with newfound confidence. What difference does it make? Cameron or Colum? It all sounds the same. When you have as much responsibility as me in making this place tick and run, you don't have time to remember the names of slackers like you. What's this I hear about you changing light bulbs on company property? You've heard correct, sir. I did indeed change the hell out of them to get some much-needed light in the break room. Looks as if everyone else is happy about it. No sense walking around like a blind man, Cameron said, the word sir in the most sardonic tone possible. Now, you're just clowning around. If you're so set on making jokes, why don't you become some kind of circus clown? I'm sure you would fit in there with all the freaks. It doesn't matter if anyone's happy about your little subversion tactics. The fact is that you've broken our policy by sticking your dirty hands in another trade's business. You have no place taking other people's jobs. I don't care how much you think you've helped. I don't care if you've grossed this company $1 billion. If you break the rules, we will break you. Don't think you can get off scot-free. I've got your name and number, and I can deal with you any time. Blind man, give me a break. You're the one who's blind as a bat if you can't read the office policy, and on top of that, miss meetings. Understand? Mr. Singer was spewing out his foul diatribe right in Cameron's face, not sparing him his putrid breath. Clear as crystal, sir, but I'm having trouble understanding why you feel the need to spit in my face. I mean, I can hear you loud and clear, and I respect what you have to say, but do you really have to hawk so incessantly? Cameron said this clearly and deliberately. He felt a subtle undercurrent of anxiety run under his skin, but he let it fuel his newborn assuredness. He stood and awaited Mr. Singer's reaction, which, to his surprise, didn't immediately follow. He waited like a military strategist who just dropped an explosive device and moved a safe distance away from it to observe the damage done. Mr. Singer was surprisingly inert at first, but soon even those furthest away in the main office could see his face condense into a bright crimson red and swell up liberally enough to see that his vascular veins were close to popping. He looked like a steam-powered machine that was threatening to blow at any moment. Yet Cameron couldn't find it within himself to care. Suddenly, Mr. Singer, sweltered and boiled like agitated factory machinery, emitted a series of new sounds that almost resembled an entirely different language. His voice rose into a new register, in which it whistled and whirred threateningly. Who do you think you are to talk to me that way? You have no right to speak to me like that. I built this place. Look at the offices, equipment, electricity, and water. My name is stamped on the front plaque. My name and reputation rings throughout the halls. I was here before you were even born. And let's be honest, that was a mistake. Your mother must be so proud of you, a slacker son. You must bring her nothing but disgrace. Cameron, with evident hesitation, responded. I'm sorry I don't live up to your standards, Mr. Singer. I didn't know I was obligated to kiss the ground you walked on. I do my job, and to be honest, I think highly of it. It's hard to have any iota of positivity, or even, I dare say, light in this office, isn't it? Are you really that heartless, sir, that you would ban light? Mr. Singer stood motionless in disbelief. It was as if all the screaming and vehemence he exhibited was taking a toll on his stamina. He was perspiring and breathing heavily. In a hoarse voice, he spoke while holding on to the desk for support. You ought to be very careful of what you say, Callum. I want you to rethink what you've said today. Normally, I'd throw you to the woods, and I could. If we lost you today, we'd be able to replace you instantly. I don't need your type of negativity and mutiny here, because that's what this is, really, mutiny in the highest degree. But because I'm benevolent, forgiving man, and instead of booting you, which is probably the least I could do, I'm going to suspend your work for 5 days with no pay. Once you develop a more work-friendly, positive attitude that benefits the workplace rather than killing it, you can come back and we can talk things over. I'll admit it, Cam. You speak your mind without a care in the world, which is bold, but the contents of that brain of yours is problematic for this workplace. We don't need changes or your silly ideas floating around here. Otherwise, people start getting complacent and they think they can destroy the system we've spent years perfecting. We can't have that. We need people building on the framework of old ideas and maintaining them for future generations. This place doesn't need light or variation. It needs dedicated workers willing to fight for the good fight, day in and day out. We don't need change here. This place will change itself through its adherence to structure. You know what you need, son? Structure. You need it in your life to succeed, especially in this job. If you walk around here like you're a jellyfish and there are creatures that can't make major life decisions, operate under stress, or get employees fired up, can they? Cameron nodded ever so slightly, but only in order for him to be left alone. He was surprised Mr. Singer had actually pronounced his name correctly this time. That rarely happened. It was as if, despite being reprimanded yet again, he had made some progress in terms of overall respect. The workplace reacted to the confrontation with a vague sense of astonishment and uncertainty. They had seen arguments with Mr. Singer before, of course, but there was something unsettling about Cameron's laconic disinterest in his boss's extreme reaction to it. They were accustomed to seeing consecutive stream of work days unfold without much variation, and certain figures, especially Mr. Singer, ensured that it stayed that way. Now, with Cameron questioning and even talking back to Mr. Singer, they knew they could not risk similarly voicing their opinions, as likewise they would be singled out. They instead chose to keep silent and to see how Cameron's punishment went about, and then prudently assess how to respond. Strange air of unsolicited silence pervaded the office. It was as if the many employees strongly desired to say what was on their minds, but couldn't because some spell had forced their lips to be sealed. In pathetic submission, they acceded to the safe and secure route of yielding to the ways of the offices. Yet Cameron's unwillingness to submit cast a foul invocation on the place. It evoked a pattern that was so obvious yet often ignored for fear of being dismissed. At the same time, however, this incident was summoning a forlorn sense of healthy critical assessment among those who for so long had wished to do as Cameron had done, but lacked the capacity or daring. So it offered some semblance of hope to the dual attorney and company that day, and that was quite enough for Cameron to walk home with a sense of victory. As he triumphantly made his way out of the main office and double doors, he was pleased to once again see Cecil, carrying a bag slung around her shoulder. As Cameron made his way over to her, he noticed that, compared to her when he had seen her a few days earlier, she looked oddly different. Her hair had grown longer since their last conversation, yet his memory was admittedly hazy as of late. She still had a warm, convivial smile, and relaxed, self-effacing way to her that was contagiously endearing. As he approached her, he found that he had an excessive confidence on that particular day, whereas on the other occasions he would have been apprehensive. "Ah, Cecil, it's been a while." "Well, maybe only a few days, but it felt like it. How are you doing?" "Oh, Cameron, it's nice to see you again." "I'm just fine, thank you for asking. How are you?" she asked as he stepped away from the doors to make room for the flow of people leaving. "I'm well, thank you. Never been better. Are you still with that customer service branch?" She looked up as if she had forgotten something, was trying to find the right words, then answered civilly. "Yes, I'm still with customer service. In fact, they just promoted me, so now I'm executive admin of our call center. It's great. I now have some say in my work. The pay is much better. The work is more laid back and looser than ever. Even if we're inundated, we can still get covered because we have shift turnouts and can take breaks. It's kind of fun, actually." She smiled in that charming way and brushed her hair with her right hand. "That's great," Cameron exclaimed. "It's good to see that you're doing well. It seems that I'm destined to be stuck in this place for eternity, and there's no room for advancement. I'm pretty much stagnant here. Dead weight. Maybe I'm not right for this career. After I was last promoted 5 or 6 years ago, I never really advanced from there. I've just plateaued." "Oh no, don't be so hard on yourself. I'm sure you're doing just fine. There's always second chances. If this doesn't work out, you can always moonlight in a different vocation and see what you like better." "I don't know about fine. I just called out Mr. Singer for being stuck up, arrogant, and selfish, and told off another coworker and friend, well, kind of friend, of mine. I've really ruined my chances here by doing that. I just felt something surge through me, a kind of otherworldly, erratic, unbound energy. Have you ever felt that? Like it wasn't even me. It was something talking through me. I've been feeling more of that lately. This strange out-of-body force running through my veins. I've been having these really bizarre dreams as well. I couldn't even explain them to you. They're so uncanny." Cameron became excited as he attempted in vain to explain. Though Cecil looked confused, she was clearly trying to understand what he was speaking about, because that was who she was, a supporter of people, a giver, a patient listener, which are rare traits to find in someone, especially in the typical crass, thoughtless city in which they dwelt. "I think I know what you mean. I've had dreams like that too. Ones where you repeat the same mistake you made in reality and it replays over and over again like a broken record. Other times, a dream will appear to me almost exactly as a vivid reality, but there will be one thing off, which makes me even more uncomfortable than dreams where several things are off. I think it's called the uncanny valley effect. It's so strange. Dreams will play out in their own separate, detached logic, and events will only make sense in the context of the dream. For example, if I have lucid nightmares where I'm half awake and I see my cat right beside me, the cat will blend in with the horrible things happening in the dream, and I'll become so frightened that my brain is triggered into a kind of defense mode. I've heard that dreams are an evolutionary byproduct to help us prepare for real-life scenarios, Cameron observed. That makes sense, observed Cecil. There always seemed to be a kind of dread to them, as if I was being told something very important. There was one time that I had a nightmare where I was attending a funeral with only me present in an empty church. 4 days later, my aunt passed away. Isn't that strange? Yes, it's very odd. I've had premonitions too, but I've always been too skeptical to accept them, said Cameron. These conversations with her had been the first time he had a real thoughtful dialogue with someone for weeks. They continued conversing intently for the next 20 minutes or so, without one dull moment. From close up, he noted that she was wearing more worn-out clothes than the previous time they met, and looked considerably more exhausted. But Cameron felt it wasn't his place to make assumptions. There was a hint of envy within him when he thought of Cecil's job. Within her hands had a kind of freedom that was entirely out of reach chimera to him. But in a sense, he was glad and happy for her. He would never wish for her to be under the wing of such a character as Mr. Singer, under the nigh impossible standards that he thrust upon his subordinates. Sure, she might have had her own particular ailments in her daily routine. She might encounter an altogether different set of challenges that for Cameron might seem insignificant, and that desolation would manifest itself in its own clever little ways as it usually does. It didn't matter if someone succeeded in their career. The second they did, a host of other problems would arise and need to be remedied. The instant someone was satiated in career climbing or home or family building, even if they were sanctified with their never-ending abundance of convenient self-repair and ameliorated bad health that cured illnesses, made trials and suffering vanish before your very eyes, it was almost like a guarantee that they would still find something to cut themselves with, for no other reason than to feel what bleeding is like. People would never feel quite fully satisfied, even with a perfect world full of perfect societies. Humanity, as a species, with a world as entropy-bound as ours, will never reach perfection. Such an aim would be quixotic and unfeasible. So now, he ruminated over his circumstances. True, he had stood up for himself as he promised Mr. Tiberius. On top of that, he had 5 days to himself, and had even had the privilege of speaking to the lovely Cecil, which warmed his heart. At long last, he had some unalloyed time to himself. What tasks could he finish? What new adventures awaited him? The future looked brighter than ever. With a newfound confidence, he began to think of other areas in his life that needed reparation. It had been a long time since he had a break more than a weekend on his hands. He contemplated all these as he strode home. His flow of thought was abruptly interrupted by something so profoundly unsettling that appeared to him only in a flash. Amidst the streets full of busy folk, each going their separate ways, stood out a familiar figure like a sore thumb that could not be ignored. Moseying down the avenue was what looked to be Mr. Tiberius himself, dressed in an immaculate white suit, with his characteristic cane, and casually puffing on his pipe. Cameron closed his eyes in disbelief, and shook his head as if it would make the image before him disappear. But sure enough, when he looked up again, Mr. Tiberius was ambling along insouciantly, without a care in the world. What made Cameron even more upset was the notion that the passerbys were paying no mind to this particular character invading their streets with its ever-glaring eye and enormous pupil darting teasingly back and forth. They instead sauntered on themselves, as if the eye was invisible. Perhaps he was. Could it be that Mr. Tiberius could manifest himself in the real world as he wished, and without awareness from anybody else? It was an odd question. Cameron considered approaching him, but decided against it. If he saw Cameron, and they interacted, it could have drastic consequences. Though he could simply be hallucinating, Cameron did not want to push his luck. After all, Mr. Tiberius had spoken morbidly about effects of meddling the dream world with the real, though he still could not tell if he was telling the truth. He decided it was best to avoid him by turning around and circumnavigating the other way, despite it being a longer route, and jogging until he was completely out of sight. For a brief moment, it almost looked as if Mr. Tiberius were looking at him with his pupil, but Cameron was almost certain that he was too great a distance to be seen. Regathering his breath, Cameron resolved it was best to head home rather than stopping anywhere along the way. This could only increase the chances of running into Mr. Tiberius, if he was truly there in the flesh, or whatever he was made of. Once he reached his familiar porch, which stood out among the rest of the otherwise practically identical houses due to his neatly kept front yard and fresh paint job. After all, Cameron walked down his familiar home street as he saw it in a new perspective, while before he would simply glance briefly at such houses and continue on his way. This time, he never felt so much out of place. The lifeless, grassless yards confined by harsh colors, warped fences, and neglected homes actually made him more uncomfortable and malcontent than usual. As soon as he arrived at his store, he rushed inside as fast as possible to avoid the seemingly unescapable, incessant creaking of his neighbor's front door and wind chimes, which added a haunting, ghostly effect. As soon as he got inside, he hurriedly took off his jacket and carelessly threw it on the couch, feeling unusually relieved. He was a free man who answered to no one, at least for now. It was almost as if he had an extended weekend at his hands. The thought of Mr. Tiberius wandering the streets came back to haunt him, and prompted him to crack open his laptop computer and research a library database he had bookmarked previously. He had been researching a wide number of topics during his bouts of insomnia, and he had skimmed through a number of catalogs on the subject of dreams, in particular, and arrived at dream symbolism, motifs, reality, and a host of other topics pertaining to it. It seemed that the more he read, the less the subject made sense. He tried to tackle the notion of falling asleep and the subconscious taking over the vulnerable mind. He read Sigmund Freud's The Interpretation of Dreams, but not before brushing off the substantial layers of dirt that had accumulated over the years, heightening his uncertainty about the relevance of the work. Despite the negative connotations linked with Freudian analysis, Cameron mused on these thoughts. Could he really just be repressing unwanted needs and desires, such as the need to succeed, fit in, and assert oneself? Or could perhaps his dreams, as he preferred to think, have deeper meanings behind them? Could he perhaps be under the sole influence of his id or ego, which had him under their grasp and shaped his external actions into whatever mold it desired? Or were his dreams entirely biologically created? Was he simply not taking care of himself, getting adequate rest or sustenance to the point that delirium took over and produced these strange visions as a means of shocking him back into good health? But he did not seem to be in particularly bad health, although he could have used more sleep. Dreams are a tricky business, as Cameron soon found out. We only have them when we are under the spell of complete or partial unconsciousness, and we often have absolutely no control over their projected images, events, sounds, or feelings, and are at a loss when it comes to how to piece them together into a cohesive narrative. At times, dreams will follow a dream logic, an internal, detached form of reasonable propositions, and will evade and even abide in the world's methods and have convincing mock-ups of people we know. Cameron was confused. What was the purpose of dreams? Dreams are a double-edged sword, Cameron also soon discovered. You can slip into them and find a peaceable, docile stream of otherworldly, unheard-of music reach your ears, or walk through a gorgeous landscape of green pastures. This can be informed by what you experientially absorbs in your daily routine, people you speak to, music you listen to, or ideas you latch onto. And it can snowball into something as pleasant as the aforementioned reverie, or something as humiliating as one of those prefatory nightmares. It seemed that Cameron had often had negative ones. He couldn't remember the last time he had an enjoyable dream as opposed to those tormenting Vieta Noirs. In fact, as long as he had been working at that morbid office, he had only such dreams. Another thought that came to Cameron was the notion that Mr. Tiberius may be some type of demon or poltergeist sent from above to haunt him for a variety of reasons. Perhaps for living a life bereft of virtue or dignity. He read of the demons of various religions, from the more well-known ones of Christianity, who were erstwhile angels that fell from grace, the jinn from Arabian folklore, to the familiar of medieval mythology, who tricked people into their cunning magic, and those ghosts that came to haunt the living. What could he have been? He also read of the early demons of Mesopotamia, who were creatures banished into the underworld, but sometimes walked the earth to terrorize humans. There is also Mara, the chief tempter of traditional Buddhism, who would attempt to corrupt the enlightened ones. And that's not to mention the Ghul or the Shila, who predicated Islam. They were sent as shapeshifters to seduce men. Although Cameron took these ideas with a pinch of salt, he remembered the time he had spent as a child in his mother's church, where there had been strong emphasis on the power of the devil. The devil is often portrayed as a trickster who lured the sacred away from God's grace. He often felt indescribable fear at the thought of them in person. how they might torment them with their fierce claws, stumpy horns, red skin, sharp teeth, loin claws, and the wings of a once heavenly angel who had chosen the path of evil and wished to corrupt men. It should be noted that these descriptions pertaining to demonology and psychology are not given to patronize the reader, but to offer a suggestion of the kinds of topics our friend Cameron had begun to stick his nose into, and to demonstrate what was going on in his mind when he stumbled upon such things, especially at such a tumultuous period in his life. So, he pondered these descriptions, especially the ones of mythological demons, or trickster figures, throughout both archaic and their symbolic meaning, discovering kinds that were brutish, taunting, and malevolent, and others that were mischievous and scheming, yet normal on the surface. Yet in that respect, Mr. Tiberius appeared nothing at all like a devil. Certainly, he had rough ears, and a kind of imposing build, an offsetting presence, and, of course, that mammoth eye, but he was also diminutive, inane, at times jovial, witty, upbeat, self-deprecating, even modest. His voice, though smooth and erudite, was also high-pitched and clowning at times. There was something almost familiar in him, a cozy warmth mixed with an aloof disposition. His character vaguely reminded Cameron of a clever uncle or a distant older friend, or a relative who visits only once every few months to a year, but offers unforgettable entertainment. Someone you know on a rudimentary level, but can have the longest conversations with. Someone who quips at everything you say, but is equally willing to deconstruct, critique, and offer to reform your ideas. Someone who shows up unannounced to various parties or events and acts as if he was invited all along. Someone who's both familiar and virtually a stranger at the same time. Someone who blends deftly into almost every social environment he passes, be it a Franciscan seminary, a Parisian intellectual cafe, a Russian Bolshevik working commune, or a Hegelian tea house. Wherever he is, he certainly mixes well with the milieu without struggling. In this venal, crafty type of image that convinced Cameron that, although Mr. Tiberius wasn't a variety of devil that would cause him bodily harm, he was someone not to be trusted. Yet, even this he was not entirely convinced of. Cameron had trusted him, and that was his mistake. Moreover, even in all his innocuous, lackadaisical procedures or lack thereof, and the convoluted flow of new ideas and proposals, and that unfailingly overwhelmed Cameron, it would be dishonest to claim that he did not feel there was anything untoward about Mr. Tiberius. There was, for instance, his unwillingness to share certain details that might be incriminating or corner him. He had danced so often around certain questions that would explicate him, or unravel his eccentric web of schemes, or put him in a box. One minute he would sing plangently along to the most romantic coronachs, with tears visible, though he would never know if they were contrived or not. But mere moments later there would arise in him a virulent stream of vaunting conceit that even the most elementary of people could detect. There was no way of climbing out of the mental quicksand of the lectures and mind games. He evaded all categorization. He was an abstraction, a ghostly figure that vaguely resembled past figures such as seminal fingers, a panjandrum leading the way, or possibly an eager bystander, listening in on the intellectual hype of a local cafe or salon in Weimar, Roubaix, or Magdalen Hall in Oxford. A trouncing, amorphous mixture of impressions, narratives, philosophies, sentiments, derisions, instructions, and even encouragements, apparently with no discernible center or core meaning to any of it. Yet here he was, Tiberius's acolyte, his devotee, without ever having desired to be in such a position. In all truthfulness, it was Mr. Tiberius who claimed, though it may have been with slight irony, that he was his guide and his commissionaire, to assist him through the doorways of the muddled chambers in both the dream world and life itself. In all his seemingly condescending, false modesty, Mr. Tiberius appeared as a kind of luminary, radiating a discreet glow among the darkest depths of Cameron's being, those areas of his character and spirit that have long been neglected. Perhaps Mr. Tiberius was no demon at all, but a kind of ersatz tutor or dignitary comprised of all those traits and characteristics he had repressed during his life and were now arising within himself unconsciously to a degree that were manifesting as lifelike. Cameron pondered again this business of dreams. He had always remembered having nightmares. However, the ones featuring Mr. Tiberius were the most disconcerting and baffling of all. He could not ascertain any evolutionary or preparative incentive within them that would make sense when grounded in reality. Who could it be pulling the strings of these phantasmagoric events? And why would he need to be thrown into the middle of it, seemingly without reason? Certainly Mr. Tiberius strongly wished to make him more courageous, intellectually sharp, imaginative, and free. The contents of his speech, language, witticisms, dialect, and ideas did not sound remotely akin to anything Cameron could conjure up. He could not recall anyone in his life that even closely resembled Mr. Tiberius in language or personality either. He was so idiosyncratic and peculiar in a way that made him intangible and elusive. He would never be able to pinpoint the origins of this collection of ideas and dialogues, but to dismiss all of these appearances as balderdash felt too imprudent. Cameron became more baffled than ever. How was he supposed to investigate the origin of dreams? He could not even determine the pedigree of characters that arose within them. This query led Cameron to research language some more, and he began to find the meanings of some of Mr. Tiberius's occasional French or Latin phrases, most of which dated to a certain period of time which appeared to him as especially obscure. Whatever life Mr. Tiberius left, if he had technically lived one, entailed a fair deal of traveling, as he freely admitted himself, and from which he had absorbed the cultures and class of many nationalities and became a more erudite person because of it. Either that, or he was simply just exceedingly well read, as apparent from all the books stacked on his shelves. Yet, how would a creature as equivocal and specific as him meld into the real world? Was he able to observe this world but not actively partake in it? Or was he cursed, as he claimed himself, destined to the confines of that nasty sewer to banter with his even stranger friends for all eternity? These were the questions that lurked on Cameron's mind as he was on the verge of slipping into a deep sleep, but little did he know that he would find no peace in his dreams.